Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Albert Cho. Honduras recently cut official ties with Taiwan, helping China grow its influence in Central America. America's de facto embassy in Taiwan, AIT, reminded Honduras that China often makes unfulfilled promises in exchange for teaching Taiwan. Joining us are Victor Zhang, former BBC World Service producer, and Vincent Zhao, Taipei City Councilor and a former political division director at the Taiwan's representative office in the United States. Victor and Vincent, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah. My first question goes to Vincent. So what is your take on this diplomatic breakup?
So I think we have to take a more holistic approach in terms of looking at what this means. So China has been poaching Taiwan's diplomatic allies pretty aggressively for the past few years. I mean, we've seen a number of countries, not only in Central America, but also the Pacific, switch relations, I think, over the past 7 to 8 years. And certainly each of these have been a blow to Taiwan's international space, but more broadly speaking, they've also been reflective, I think, of the PRC's desire to diminish Taiwan's diplomatic clout and to potentially gain geostrategic advantages in areas where they haven't had much of a foothold in the past. So when it comes to Central America and when it comes to, for example, this case of Honduras in particular, we have to keep in mind China doesn't engage in diplomacy for altruistic reasons. And there's certainly no evidence to suggest that China is willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, if not to gain a political or geostrategic advantage. So certainly, I think what the Chinese are looking at this point are a couple of things. First one, they're looking at Taiwan heading into our presidential election. And certainly, by taking away Honduras, you drive a blow to Taiwan's foreign policy and you erode Taiwan's diplomatic legitimacy to a small degree. But second of all, I think they're also looking at President Tsai's upcoming transit to the United States and visit to Guatemala and Belize. And I think to a certain extent, this is designed to coincide with that visit and to ensure that Taiwan knows and international community knows that China will continue to have the ability to take away Taiwan's diplomatic allies if they so choose. So I think, stepping back 3 steps, I think we have to be very, very careful in terms of how we look at this. We're not going to be able to engage in terms of dollar diplomacy, competing dollar against dollar on what the Chinese are able to offer. We're not going to be able to stoop to China's levels in terms of bribing government officials, as, for example, the recent case in Micronesia when their president came out and said, no, I mean, their ambassador came to their vice president with like suitcases full of cash. We're not going to be able to do that. But what we are able to do is we're going to be able to continue to show our diplomatic allies that Taiwan is a more sustainable way forward, and that what we're able to provide in terms of education, agriculture, healthcare, so forth, should be the better choice going forward. And so I have every confidence that's what we'll continue to try to do.
All right. What about you, Victor? Do you think that we should stop on still adopting this dollar diplomacy and instead of doing something that we can do more aggressive diplomacy against China?
I think talking about the dollar diplomacy, we have been there before, and it doesn't work well. Okay, dollar diplomacy only benefited those corrupted politicians.
Okay.
So let me put an example. Taiwan donated a jet to a country. Okay, the purpose for this donation is transport a patient from the rural areas. But the leader of that country turned this jet into his own private jet.
Okay.
So dollar diplomacy benefits not the people, but corrupted politicians. And another thing is the appetite of these corrupted politicians will become bigger and bigger every time.
Okay.
And they will switch to the other side within a second. So I don't think that the dollar diplomacy works for Taiwan. And I do agree with what Vincent said. We need to show those countries, our friends, say, okay, we are helping you, but with a solid result and with a sincere heart.
Yeah, but I think emotion would be one thing, but also material will be another, right? I mean, it would be naive to suggest that they don't want money or they don't want any kind of material supports whatsoever. That would be naive to say that. But to be realistic, I think Victor is right that it's hard for us to compete against China. But we do have an advantage. For example, we have this chip making industry and also skill about that. And what kind of strength do we have when it comes to making friends with foreign nations and help them in what they need?
Well, I'll start by saying this. I think that Victor's on point that, it's very difficult for us to play this game of dollar diplomacy. And, it's not so much an issue of us being able to spend a certain amount. It's really bringing forward this culture of competing for influence through dollars. And that's not something exactly we want to do, because I think that's a corrupting influence in democracies worldwide, and certainly it's contrary to our own values. But to your point, I want to talk a little bit about Taiwan's disadvantages before I go to advantages, because there are many disadvantages. So we have to understand that in the past, when we had diplomatic relations with many countries in Central America, I mean, previously with the exception of Costa Rica, almost the entire Central America and Caribbean had recognized Taiwan at one point. And similarly with the Pacific, we had the majority of countries at one point, and that's dwindled down to 4 right now. But my point being that when we established diplomatic relations with these countries were in a much different place economically than they are today. And so when we had, for example, agricultural teams go there, we had healthcare teams go there, we had, scholarships and so forth, that benefited them a lot more during 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago than they do today. When these countries have economically developed to a certain degree where they don't actually need, agricultural teams, they need investment, they need trade, they need folks to go there and set up economic zones and so forth. And so, you're right, especially in a point that, yes, we do have these major companies like TSMC, but there are limits to what, for example, a free and open society such as ours can order our private enterprise to do. I mean, we have to create incentives, and it's actually very difficult to create incentives in these third countries, especially when we're talking about smaller and relatively economically underdeveloped countries. So, to the point about advantages, what I will say advantages is this. I do think we're not going to be able to compete in terms of trade and investment by itself. I think what we are going to be able to compete is showing these countries that we're here to stay. So what we see, for example, when China moves in, is they dole out hundreds of $millions in infrastructure projects and debt and so forth. But as soon as their political objective is finished, in this case, the switch of diplomatic relations, then they take a hands-off approach because they're complete. They finished their job here. And so, these countries are left to pay off these loans. But, new loans aren't forthcoming, new investment isn't forthcoming. And so, on the other hand, us, I mean, when we're in a country, we're not going to be able to match 50 million, 100 million, $200 million, but we're going to be there consistently. And we're going to, year over year, kind of work hand in hand with that country. So that's what we should be focused on.
Yeah, so we look forward to a long-term kind of benefits or kind of influence to the country instead of like short-term. Okay, I'm curious. There was a former Taiwanese ambassador called Jiewon-ji. He suggests that if Taiwan's foreign minister hadn't promised the $1.2 billion deal to buy Lithuanian rum and chocolates, Honduras would have remained as an ally. Knowing this, Honduran President Castro demanded hefty $2 billion USD in economic aid to avoid switching recognition to China. So do you both agree with the ambassador's viewpoint? Maybe Victor first.
Well, first of all, I don't know what Mr. Tsai's entire speech or his comment. So I wouldn't say I agree or disagree. But if such theory stands, then we need to look at what is the trade deal between Taiwan and Lithuania. The so-called $1.5 billion of funds it's not a loan. It's a fund for business transactions and also for future investments. We all know in Lithuania they are quite good at certain technologies. And that's nothing to do with chocolate and rum. But if we look at what the Honduran government asked for, that's something totally different. Okay, such as we need to carry $2 billion worth of loan for them, And let me see whether I got the number correct. And $200 million US dollars to build a dam, and $90 million to build a hospital.
Yeah, that's a lot actually.
Yeah, as gift. You don't, which means you don't need to pay back.
Right. Yeah.
You don't need to pay back. Okay, that's two different things. That's entirely two different things. The trade deal with Lithuania is what in the business world called the guarantee of payment. It's totally opposite word than what the Honduran government asked for.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, two different situations. Go ahead.
So I think Ambassador Jia's comments are misleading at best and a falsehood at worst. And the point about $1.2 billion to buy chocolate and rum, I mean, that's a lot of chocolate and rum. Like just by looking at it, I think people have started to have question marks in their head. How much really went to chocolate and rum? And in fact, it's not a lot. I mean, actually the $1.2 billion were more strategic investments that are targeted from our government into private sectors that are able to enhance cooperation with Taiwan, for example, the semiconductor industry and so forth. And so it's far different from what Honduras is asking for. And I want to say one thing, which is that if this logic holds true, we have a $88 billion bilateral trade amount with Japan.
Right.
Then by his logic,
by sake,
that would be probably 70 diplomatic allies right there with Japan. It's comparing apples with oranges. I think it's a horrible comparison.
Okay. All right. We actually spoke to Paul Huang, a freelance journalist and a research fellow at Taiwan Public Opinion Foundation, about his analysis and opinion on Honduras ending diplomatic relations with Taiwan and recognizing the PRC. Let's take a look.
President Tsai is making a visit to its Central American allies and to see Kevin McCarthy, the U.S. House of Representatives Speaker. Some journalists and commentators have risen concern over whether this will provoke China. What are your thoughts?
She's not doing really anything that is unusual or special or different from before. This is, again, China would issue their own statements, say the usual thing, but I don't think this is any big thing on China's mind or on their watch list. This is just usual Taiwan president making a gesture, making the usual display.
Honduras announced that it will be making a switch to recognize China shortly before Tsai's visit. What do you know about this?
The last 2 years, there have been various reports, speculation that this was going to happen sooner or later, and now it eventually happened. We have long been aware that the current president of Honduras is not very good view about the Honduras relation with Taiwan, the Republic of China, and she saw that establishing a relation with the People's Republic of China would be a better political bargain for them. And so she made that decision, and Taiwan lost another diplomatic ally. And when they look at things like this, it makes a lot of sense for them to choose China instead of Taiwan, just because the sheer size of China's economy, the resources that it could offer, or at least promise. Now, again, Taiwan often accused China as being breaking those promises that it made to countries that broke off relations with Taiwan before. Some of those were of course true, that the China promised them but didn't deliver, or didn't deliver as much as they promised. But you have to look at it from political strategic aspect as well. For these countries, for politicians in these countries, what would be a better country to have a relation with, right? One with 1.3 or even 4 billion people, or one with 23, 24 million people. And China has much more economic, technology, diplomatic resources there is. So politically, the leaders of most of these remaining diplomatic allies, they're going to look at this reality, and the temptation is always there to be the person in history to establish a relation with China. In fact, that's what motivated President Richard Nixon of the U.S. to reapproach China in the first place in the early 1970s. And later, President Jimmy Carter broke off former diplomatic relation with Taiwan, the ROC, and established a relation with PRC. The United States was one of the country that made such a sacrifice or choices, depends on how you see it.
It is clear that the competition between the United States and China isn't going to die down anytime soon, especially after the U.S. showed support for Taiwan when China convinced Honduras to switch diplomatic recognition. So let's pivot now and dive into one of the ways that the United States might try to contain China through the use of proxy strategy. So I guess my first question goes to Victor. For our international audience, would you please briefly define what a proxy strategy would look like in the context of containing China?
Okay, in my view, let's see what is the definition listed on the Cambridge Dictionary. It says a war fought between groups or smaller countries that each represents the interests of other larger powers and may have help and support from these larger powers. But I have to say, when it comes to Taiwan's case, Taiwan will be the one who fight for survival. So does that fit into the definition of proxy war listed on the Cambridge Dictionary? I have my doubt. We do share common interest and values with America, with other peace-loving and democratic countries. But using such a word, proxy war, to describe Taiwan, I don't think that's something I will agree with.
Okay, well, actually, there are several U.S. scholars, I believe that Vincent knows this pretty well, indicates this possibility. But also, as I remember, the definition of proxy war does not necessarily mean that one being fully exploited, for the advantage of the one who uses it. So it depends on different contexts. But also, I think your opinion is pretty precise that I think Taiwan probably should not be regarded as a proxy for the United States. What about you, Vincent?
I think if anything, it's probably the opposite. The United States is seen as a proxy for Taiwan in some cases. And I'll say as clear as I can. I mean, the CCP isn't coming for the United States. They're not coming to take away U.S. freedoms. They're not coming to take away Americans' way of life. They're coming against Taiwan. And we have to be clear. I mean, this is our democracy, our freedoms, our free economy, our human rights that we're defending here. And we're faced with this humongous, I think, onslaught of military might from across the strait. And they've targeted over 1,000 missiles here against Taiwan. They've launched several of those last year when former Speaker Pelosi came around. But I want to be clear in a sense that this is our battle. This is our war. This is our survival that we're talking about. And we are deeply, deeply grateful when the United States, when other like-minded countries say that, Taiwan's security is related to their own security and that they have a willingness to come here and to defend Taiwan from the threat we face. But we should not take that for granted. We should never take that for granted because ultimately we're responsible for our own defense. Right. And I don't think we have any standing or any right to ask countries, to demand countries come to defend our freedoms and our values. So, in a sense, why I talked about the U.S. being a proxy, because again, I want to emphasize, this isn't the U.S.'s war against China. I mean, Taiwan is a factor in why U.S. competition with China has increased dramatically over the past few years. But America has never been in the driver's seat of that. China has. And so as we look at, for example, how we're facing geostrategically, we have to be clear that this is not the U.S. against China. This is freedom and democracy against authoritarianism around the world. And so I do agree with Victor in a sense. I disagree with the characterization that Taiwan is in a proxy war or is a potential proxy for the United States.
Let me ask the question another way. What kind of help does the United States need from allies to contain China? This is from the perspective of the United States government. Maybe Victor.
Well, that's something we are already doing because we exchange information, intelligence with the United States And it seems like, yes, on the tabletop, you won't see any military exchanges. But under the table, I do think we have a very healthy so-called either training or military assistance is going on. So I think the main point is Taiwan not only become the gatekeeper
Right.
for the peace of the Pacific region, or even larger places. And Taiwan also plays a very important role to sustain the U.S. economy as well.
Okay. But also on the other hand, I'm also curious about Vincent's perspective on this. So like what a U.S. airlines like us stand to gain from picking sides, because a lot of people in Taiwan might argue that we are like just biased towards the United States too much. It's too far, so we have to come back. So what's your take on this?
Well, it's very tempting to suggest that just by sitting out, I mean, this whole thing would just blow right past and Taiwan doesn't have to play a part in this global clash between authoritarianism and democracy. That's a very tempting thought. I wish it was true. Unfortunately, it's not. I mean, we have to be clear that every day the threat we face doesn't come from across anywhere else but China. And China is very intent on completing what for them is a historical imperative, which is the unification of Taiwan peacefully, but hopefully, but also by force if necessary.
Right.
And so Xi Jinping has made that very clear, including in last November when he released his new era white paper on Taiwan, that unification is the only end result. So by sitting out, that still applies to us. I mean, we don't gain anything by sitting out. On the contrary, I do think we gain a lot by being able to enhance our relations with the democratic actors around the world, in the United States in particular. And so to your question about what are the things that would substantively help Taiwan, twofold. First of all, deterrence, as much as possible, as soon as possible. We need to get everything in Taiwan. We need to make sure that we have robust deterrence through asymmetric means. We have robust not only capabilities, but also reserves in place, because for the sole reason that this will help China think twice about them potentially waking up one day and feeling that this is the day they're going to invade Taiwan. They're going to take a look at Taiwan's defense capability and say, well, we just can't do it. So that's first of all. Second of all is international support. So when we factor in, for example, what I mentioned about U.S. potential support for Taiwan, we also have to think that support by other democratic actors, Japan, Australia, United Kingdom, EU, Canada, all of this introduces new variables into the relationship, and it changes China's calculus about whether they can sustain themselves in terms of an invasion scenario. And so I do think it's very, very important that we have deterrence in place, but also have a robust partnership with democracies.
Kind of quick follow-up, but do you think that U.S. so far offer enough incentives for all of the airlines to stay together? Because sometimes you see, President Biden would say, like we still stick to one China policy and so on, so you don't need to get me wrong from the China side. So
I think every country in the world looks to the United States for leadership. And so the U.S. will have to lead by example in this case, and I think they have. So when Biden, for example, comes out and says that, yes, I mean, the U.S. is committed to defending Taiwan, that gives a lot of flexibility and leeway for countries like Japan, Australia, and others to rethink about their defense strategy. So I think the U.S. should continue doing what they've been already doing, which is make that commitment very public and clear.
So just like what I suggested, we are fighting our own war. We are protecting our own territory. So it's not like we rely on the United States for full support without our own input into it. Okay. While President Tsai Ing-wen is transiting the United States en route to Central America, former President Ma Ying-jeou visited China right before her trip. He was willing not to be called former president of Taiwan. While in China, this is the first trip by a Taiwanese president since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. While on the other hand, 37 anti-war scholars urged Taiwan to work to avoid a U.S.-China war by maintaining healthy ties with both countries. They demand the United States end its militarism and sanctions against Russia. A united Taiwan against China, not its partner, is key to U.S. success. While China also manipulates anti-American sentiments here. I have a question for both of you. So what issues do you see or problem in divided Taiwanese public sentiments on China? Maybe Victor?
I think the problem is the internal politics influenced our external policy.
Okay.
Because what these people or scholars or I would say the so-called U.S. skeptics, what in their mind is, are they really skeptical about the Americans? I don't really think so. But they really hate DDP.
Yeah, they hate DPP more so than China.
Yeah,
Right.
so, no, they really hate the DPP, so they are willing enough to condemn the DPP instead of, no matter what the DPP has done, okay? But for the Chinese part, they just kind of like hoping the Chinese will ease their iron grip or they will ease their stance on the Taiwan issue. So for their ideas, is maybe because they grew up in an environment that an independent Taiwan is totally unacceptable. So which kind of fit into the criteria that the mainland China or the Beijing likes to see.
What about you?
Well, to be honest, I think these so-called anti-war scholars are a joke, frankly. And a number of them have come out publicly and said that the U.S. is actually behind the Ukrainian war and that Ukraine should make peace with Russia at all costs, including sacrificing part of its sovereign territory. And I think this rhetoric is just so close, if not overlapping with the rhetoric coming from the Kremlin and coming from Beijing, that it's actually very tough to take these people seriously. And so all of us want peace. I mean, everybody here in this room wants peace. The 23 million people of Taiwan want peace. But I think where we differ in terms of these scholars is what is the best way to achieve it. I don't think peace can be achieved by just saying, I want peace. I mean, peace can be achieved by actually having realistic policies that take into account, I think, the situation we're in. So I do have to be very clear on the last point, which is that the best way to achieve peace for Taiwan is to ensure that China never feels they have the confidence to be able to engage in a cross-strait invasion scenario.
Right. I appreciate the comments, but also, you guys have to notice that there's a kind of new phenomenon coming up in Taiwan. A new poll from a Taiwanese Public Opinion Foundation shows as much as 77% of the respondents hope ties with China recover. And the chairman of the foundation, Liu Yinglong, he said that changes in the public attitude comes from the Chinese government letting tourists and spouses visit Taiwan through Kinmen, and also reinstating flights between Taiwan and the Chinese cities and others. Although China once said that cross-strait transportation would not be resumed unless Taiwanese people and also the government needs to accept the 92 consensus. But it has relaxed its air travel. Why is that? I mean,
Sure. Could I go first? And
sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I want ties with China to improve as well. I think the vast majority, I'm surprised it's not 99%. I think the vast majority of Taiwanese people would like to see that. But we have to be clear. I mean, the Chinese have set preconditions before that, which is that the government has to accept this idea of the 92 consensus. Unfortunately, in 2019, January 2nd, I think Xi Jinping came out and publicly said that, hey, look, the 92 consensus is a precursor to unification. I don't think unification is what the people of Taiwan want. And so therefore it's become very difficult politically, even for the opposition, to just accept this idea of the 92 consensus. And this is why we saw in domestic news a few days ago where the opposition party came out and said, hey, the 92 consensus actually doesn't mean what we've told you it meant for past decades. It actually means the Republic of China. And then later that was, of course, disavowed by the same opposition party. But my point being, again, that everybody wants peace. But I think there has to be a smarter way of achieving it without sacrificing our sovereignty and without sacrificing our security.
Okay, Victor.
I think everybody would like to see a better relationship between Taiwan and China. But this latest poll is in regard of better ties. It's not about pro-unification or pro-independence. If we put the question into pro-unification or pro-independence, I think the result will be totally different. So let's make it clear. We don't want a war. But we have to make sure when there is a war coming, that we are already ready.
All right. I guess my further question for both of you is that, do you think that the new sentiments or new public attitudes is as a consequence of the Chinese friendliness first, so that we can, in the public, we feel that sense of friendliness, and we kind of give them positive response?
I think any gesture of Chinese goodwill towards Taiwan should be appreciated, full stop.
Okay.
But I do think that we also have to question the timing of these gestures coming right before Taiwan's presidential election and whether there's an ulterior political motive behind it, first of all. But second of all, even if you have on the surface friendly gestures from China, such as, for example, resuming cross-strait flights and so forth, it doesn't change the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are that to have a marked and substantive improvement in relations, China requires the acceptance of the 92 consensus, which is roundly unacceptable to the majority of Taiwanese people.
We actually spoke earlier to Dennis Ong, an associate professor at Sam Houston State University, about recent signs of Taiwan's desire to improve its relationship with China. Our conversation followed a press conference held by a group of Taiwanese scholars, as we just mentioned, against the war, which raised concerns over the existence of a U.S. skeptic segments in Taiwanese society. Let's take a look.
Recently, a group of Taiwan scholars made an anti-war declaration and advocated equal distancing Taiwan's relationship with both China and the United States. What position do you take on the issues, and what are your thoughts on Taiwan's current position amidst U.S.-China great power competition? Does the U.S. intend to utilize its partnership or alliance with Taiwan, Japan, and India to bear the brunt of the fallout of competing with China? If so, how?
Some people, like I said, in Taiwan, they're really concerned about the escalated tension between U.S. and China. So they desire for peace and stability for Taiwan. Second of all, they're really concerned about the external influence, the so-called external influence, not only from China, but also they worry about the pressure from the U.S. forcing Taiwan to get ready for a war that actually pushing Taiwan to a real military confrontation. That's the concern. And of course, on the other hand, people also argue the U.S. try to protect Taiwan or try to help Taiwan protect itself. What's the purpose of that? We have to remember this. The U.S. utilized its diplomatic relation to pursue certain U.S. interests, just like any other country. All countries do very similar things. For instance, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, which include the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, is probably not accurate to say U.S. try to utilize their allies to compete against China. Instead, we should try to say, try to understand every country has their own national interests. We have to have overall, I believe the U.S. tried to do its best to protect its interests, but also try to align its interests with their allies in this region, including Taiwan.
A new poll released by Taiwan Public Opinion Foundation indicates that as much as 77% of Taiwanese respondents look forward to recovering their relations with China. The TPOF chairman, You Yilong, said that the change in the public attitude in Taiwan towards China comes from rapprochement from China. So what are your thoughts on this poll? Do you think that this indicates a shift away from the widespread skepticism on China, as we saw ahead of the 2020 election?
What we can see from this poll is that it's the number indicate a lot of people in Taiwan try to find a way, try to ask the government, try to ask the politician, find a way to reconcile the situation. Now they specifically mention find a peaceful way to deal with China. The slightly difference shows a lot of change indeed happening in Taiwan.
What is your opinion on President Ma's upcoming visit to China? Do you think he made this visit to sort of display a difference between him and his party versus President Tsai Ing-wen's visit to California during her transit?
His visit, President Ma's visit, indeed reflect the diverse opinions on the cross-strait relations, attitude toward cross-strait relations. Try to show Taiwan, at least another portion of Taiwanese people willing to embrace mainland China, willing to be friendly and have friendly attitude toward China. So it's not intentionally counterbalance President Tsai's visit, but it has a consequence. It has an implication that Taiwan has different opinion toward U.S. and China. That's for one. Like I said, I don't believe President Ma intentionally counterbalanced President Tsai's visit. President Ma is a retired president, follow Taiwan's rules and regulation. He wanted to visit his family root and try to find his certain family history. It's reasonable and it's understandable.
So for both of you, does this mean China also on its side has realized the threats no longer work? Because we just saw that it softened its tone. And what should we learn as Taiwanese from confronting China?
I think it's going to be a carrot and stick approach all the way to the elections and beyond. And I think they do take a good cop, bad cop approach. They take a bad cop approach when they feel like they need to make a point across. And so there are, for example, there have been last year economic sanctions, military overflights, diplomatic outreach to Taiwan's diplomatic allies and so forth. But when, for example, elections come around, it's also a good cop. It's that, have a good relationship with China, and will bring benefits to Taiwan. So we'll resume buying, for example, liquor from Jingmen, as an example. So I do think we have to be very smart about it. We do think we have to look at the foundation of what this relationship entails.
Sure. Victor, very quick. Yeah.
I think, as I said, there must be a price for Taiwanese to pay for these softened attitude or a nicer gesture.
All right. Okay. Let's now talk about President Tsai Ing-wen's meeting. For Vincent, this one goes to you. You will lead the political division at the Taiwan-U.S. Tell us about how transit diplomacy works, how that works.
So transits are actually very interesting because they're technically not visits. They're transits.
Yeah.
And so transits, I think, are more limited in scope. I mean, there's, I think, limitations in sort of the official engagements you can engage in. But I will say that transits have improved markedly over the past few years. And previously, during the Ma administration, what you saw were very low-key transits. For example, no press, no publicity. Our media couldn't even follow stories until the plane was in the air again. And when he held, for example, dinners with the Taiwanese American community, you'd even have to put your cell phone away in lockers because you wouldn't allow people to take pictures. And so we're grateful all of that has changed. And so our president transits with, I think, a lot of dignity right now that befits her position. I do think that there's the U.S. has changed its position on publicity regarding transits and so forth. But I will say this. Transits are very symbolic. They're not just substantive, they're also symbolic. Because there are very few places our president can go. And by having an ability to transit in the United States, it shows that Taiwan is not as diplomatically isolated as China would like us to believe.
Victor, so what does it mean when we see President Tsai Ing-wen meet up with McCarthy? How does that differ from Tsai Ing-wen's meeting with Nancy Pelosi last August? One is United States going to be, the other one is gonna be was in China, in Taiwan.
First of all, they both are speakers, right? Nancy Pelosi was the speaker at then, and McCarthy is the current speaker. So, but the difference is McCarthy is the Republican Party member. So it shows is a bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress to support Taiwan. And so this is not only symbolic, and it is important. Because if you look at China or certain countries, maybe they can have one party to support them, or several congressmen or senators will support them. But not like this, not in this scale. The both parties support Taiwan. I think that's the most important point.
It's sort of like a bipartisan consensus over there on the Capitol Hill. But also, I wonder, is it possible for us to see any further progress in the U.S.-Taiwan ties after McCarthy and Tsai Ing-wen's meeting in the United States? Any kind of speculation? Might be very highly speculative, but what's your guess on this?
Our foremost objective is to engage in some sort of far-reaching trade deal with the United States. And the reason is because we talked about earlier, in a sense that we're not a command economy. We're a free market economy, and so when we want countries, when we want companies to divest from China, to reduce their trade dependence with China, you got to provide them incentives. You got to tell them why it's good to trade with the U.S., with Japan, rather than force them to do so, because you're not going to get a result on the latter. And so this has been a long-term goal for us. Right now, Congress actually plays a major part because they haven't approved a new trade promotion authority bill, which allows USTR, the United States Trade Representative, to actually engage in substantive discussions about tariff reductions. So they got to first authorize the United States government, led by USTR, to be able to engage in tariff reductions. And so I do hope that as a result of these high-level engagements, we're going to be able to see Congress that comes out and say, hey, we may not be willing to do trade deals with the rest of the world right now, but for Taiwan, we'll make an exception because economic security is directly correlated with national security.
But do you think Taiwanese government is willing to take that? Any hurdles, like possibly?
Again, there's a massive hurdle, which is American public opinion right now. So American public opinion is massively not in favor of free and open trade. But I do think that hopefully there can be an exception made for Taiwan, first of all, on the interest of national security, but also second of all, that by engaging with Congress, there's such goodwill towards Taiwan that the United States is able to think kind of Taiwan as a separate entity rather than lumping us together with all these other potential trade partners that the U.S. public doesn't necessarily want to see.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess my question for Victor is that as long as Tsai Ing-wen's meeting with McCarthy is a low-key and isn't going to be in Washington, some say that China's reaction won't be stronger than the previous time when Pelosi's visit in Taiwan. So what's your take on this? What's your expectation that gonna be any kind of military reaction from China afterwards?
I would say, first of all, it makes no difference. No matter how low-key or let's say the restraint that the President Tsai will do, but her trip itself will be eyesore enough for the Beijing anyway. So I would say make no difference. A military exercise like last time, I'm not quite sure because it's quite costly. And another thing is, when President Xi of China went to Moscow meeting with Vladimir Putin, the American regard him, well, on the issue of Ukraine particularly, American government has already regarded him as standing on the wrong side of the line. So I'm not sure how much the Beijing is willing enough to show their muscle over Taiwan and bear the possible retaliation from the United States.
It looks like China can do nothing but only make a request to the United States that, okay, since we guys have to deal with the fact that Taiwan is going to visit or transit the United States, and why not do something else to us as a favor? For example, send your Vice President, VP Kamala Harris to China as an exchange. But also on the other hand, the Chinese government, put the pressure on Honduras to break the tie with us. So how do you view this kind of approach from the Chinese side?
I think the reaction is actually going to be far different. I think the Chinese are going to be much more restrained this time around. And it has to do mostly, I think, with the good cop, bad cop routine. We're heading too close to the election where any provocative actions from China would backfire spectacularly on their desired interest here in Taiwan. And so I do think that we're going to see a much more restrained reaction. I don't think we're going to see the same level of hysteria kind of domestically within China as well. I do think that they're going to wait and see what happens until after the 24 elections in terms of who is elected, which party is elected, their policies going forward before they decide how they're going to lump this together with the whole slew of responses that they'll have designed by that point. But so we're at good cop phase right now. It could very rapidly go to bad cop phase soon.
Right. So still too early to tell that what kind of response and also the backlash as a consequence of all this going on, so much going on now, United States, in China, and also in the Taiwan Strait, right?
The China will heavily rely on what I would say the associates of Beijing inside of Taiwan to stir up things. But for maybe they will scale down or like Vincent say will be more restrained or refrained from doing certain things. But they will definitely, in my belief, they will definitely increase their influence through their associates inside of Taiwan, so that they can hopefully to influence the result of the next year's elections.
Okay.
I think Victor's point is really covert versus overt. And so we saw a lot of overt actions in response to Pelosi's. I think Victor's point is we'll see a lot of covert reactions in terms of a potential meeting with McCarthy. But I do want to point one last thing out, which is a meeting in California with Speaker McCarthy actually does not preclude an actual physical face-to-face meeting here in Taiwan sometime in the future. And I think McCarthy had at one point alluded to that as well. So certainly, I do think that certainly, yes, having a meeting in California makes sense right now, but I do think that the Chinese would reserve their judgment, and the Chinese would probably wait and see in terms of whether physical meeting is held here in Taiwan before reacting the same way they did during Pelosi's visit last year.
We actually have a side kind of story to the whole main thing is that it is expected that when President Tsai Ing-wen meet up with McCarthy, another important figure from the Select Committee on China, right? And he's going to be with McCarthy, Mike Gallagher, yes.
Right.
So what do you expect from the three parties, so to speak, meeting?
So Mike Gallagher is actually a friend of mine. I knew him when I was in D.C. He's a congressman from Wisconsin.
Pretty young too, like 38 or something.
38,
right.
Decorated Marine, But the point is, he has his eyes wide open, and he knows. I think Gallagher knows something on China, which is he has a bipartisan consensus on how to deal with China. Previously, the Republicans are saying we got to be tough on China. Democrats are saying, well, let's wait and see. Now both sides are saying, no, be tough on China.
Hi there, I'm Albert Cho from Taiwan Talks. On the show, we delved into the impact of Honduras breaking diplomatic ties with Taiwan, as well as the significance of President Tsai's U.S. transit and the former President Ma Ying-jeou's visit to China. We also discussed the possibility of the United States relying on its Asian allies to contain China. These are ongoing stories, and we would love to hear your thoughts. So drop us a comment on YouTube, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Catch you next time.